Good morning, dear students. Welcome back to the new class today. Today I'll be continuing with whatever we left. We actually stopped our discussion in the last class and we are going to proceed further in the lesson. So, without wasting any time, let us start. Now, yesterday we actually discussed in great detail about the impact of the First World War on the Indian national movement, on the cause of the Indian national movement. We also talked about the advent of Gandhi ji. We also talked about his Satyagraha Andolan or the Satyagraha movement, that is Champaran, Kheda, and Ahmedabad. Uh, Now today we are going to continue further in the lesson. Now, if you remember, I had shown you these slides yesterday, and I had also asked you to find out the names of these important personalities as depicted on the slides. So definitely you can just have a look again, just take a look again onto the slide, and you can just try to know their names as well if you have not found it out. So these are the important revolutionaries, and you know the name of the important revolutionaries: Bhagat Singh, Sukhdev, Rajguru. So you are aware of these important revolutionaries, and these revolutionaries, absolutely in their own way, they also contributed to the Indian national movement because they also wanted the freedom from the foreign clutch, from the foreign rule, from the foreign domination. So they were active. They started with their set of activities. They started with their set of activities which was not absolutely accepted by the colonial government. So in order to check on these activities, or in order to kind of put a halt onto the activities of the revolutionaries, the colonial government introduced what is called the Rowlatt Act. So as I also mentioned you earlier, that yes, I mentioned this to you earlier in the previous class, that nothing in history happens in isolation. If any event has happened, if any act has been introduced, if any development takes place, there is a kind of background story to it and a kind of background connection to it. And this background story and connection here is the activities on part of the revolutionaries actually made the colonial government to introduce the Rowlatt Act. Please remember this. Establish connections when you are reading history. This is very, very important. So let us now get into the content for the Rowlatt Act. So if you talk about the Rowlatt Act, we talk about the year 1919, and this act was passed in the Imperial Legislative Council. The Indian members in the Imperial Legislative Council, they opposed this. They were not in favor of this. They were not in favor of the passage of this act, of the implementation of this act. Gandhiji absolutely was also against it at the same point of time. Now, why? The big question is why Indians opposed it? Why Gandhiji also opposed it? Why other leaders also opposed it? Because this act actually gave enough power to the colonial government to suppress the political activities and to detain the political prisoners without trial up to 2 years. Let me just elaborate on this. Now, any kind of opposition on part of the colonial government, any kind of opposition led by the people of the country, commoners, revolutionaries, leaders, was definitely a political opposition. So any such opposition had to be suppressed, had to be checked. And those involved in politically criticizing the colonial government were arrested and they were detained and they were in the jail, they were imprisoned for 2 years without trial. So this was something which was not accepted by the participants, by the people of the country, by the revolutionaries, by the leaders, by the commoners, by Gandhiji. So for these set of reasons, this uh, act which was introduced in the Imperial Legislative Council was opposed. You may get a question on the clauses of the act, so you please write about these two important points: suppressing the political activities and detaining the political prisoners without trial for up to 2 years. Moving ahead. So, when this act was passed, then absolutely Gandhiji wanted to oppose this activity as well. So he was doing, he was actually taking the steps. Definitely, he was a firm believer of ahimsa and non-violence. So he decided that yes, he will oppose this activity of the government, and then he will use the non-violent civil disobedience movement against such unjust laws. Unjust, that was unjustified, that was inhuman, just putting somebody in jail without trial for 2 years. So Gandhiji decided that yes, he will absolutely launch a non-violent civil disobedience movement against it. And how did he do it? He started a nationwide hartal on 6th of April 1919. So 6th of April 1919 becomes very important. It was observed as a Satyagraha day when people all over the country in support of Gandhiji against the Rowlatt Act, they observed fast and hartal. So rallies were organized in different cities. The workers went on strike in the railway workshops, and the shops were also closed down. Dear students, please understand how the people participated. They participated in rallies, they organized rallies. The railway workers, they went on strike. The shops were closed down. The local leaders, they were the target. Okay, of course, this is something very, very simple to know and understand, that the moment people started agitating against the British government, the government became aware, and then definitely the government had to suppress and repress the activities of the people. So how the government was doing it? The government definitely will take care of the leaders. So here the government, picked up the local leaders from Amritsar. There are two important leaders who were picked up, and though the names are not mentioned here right now in this slide, you may just try to find out the names of two important leaders. As well as Mahatma Gandhi was barred from entering Delhi. Gandhiji was not allowed to enter Delhi. So this is the way how the government was taking care of the agitation on part of the people and the leaders. Then comes 10th of April 1919, and the police in Amritsar fired upon a peaceful procession, provoking widespread attack on banks and governmental buildings. This is again very important to know and understand, that yes, people were agitating against the implementation of the Rowlatt Act, and people under the leadership of Mahatma Gandhi were trying to do their bit through some non-violent method. So there was a peaceful procession, okay, which was happening in Amritsar. Fine. And then the police in Amritsar fired on that peaceful procession. And when all this happened, people were absolutely, surprised. And surprised in the sense the way they were treated, because they were just the participants in the peaceful procession. And then that provoked the people, that provoked the participants. In return of that, what did they do? They attacked the governmental buildings and the banks. So I hope this slide is clear to you. In this particular slide, we talked about the activities of revolutionaries, which is a background to the implementation of the Rowlatt Act. We also talked about how it was implemented in the Imperial Legislative Council. Did the Indians oppose? Yes. Did the leaders oppose? Yes. Gandhiji also was against it. Then what were the clauses of this act? That yes, political activities to be suppressed, and the political prisoners would be in jail without trial for 2 years. When all this was happening, Gandhiji introduced and announced the nationwide Satyagraha, that is the Hartal, the nationwide Hartal, on 6th of April 1919. Throughout the country, people supported this particular decision of Gandhiji by observing fast and Hartal. Then you have the rallies being introduced and organized in different cities. The workers, they went on strike in the railway workshops. The shops were closed. When all this was happening, the government became aware. The local leaders were the target. The local leaders were picked up from Amritsar. Mahatma Gandhi was not allowed to enter Delhi. 10th of April happened and a peaceful procession took place in Amritsar. The police started firing on that peaceful procession. And then the crowd became violent and attacked the banks and the other governmental buildings. Let us proceed to the next slide now. Okay, you can see these images in this slide, and I'm sure you must be able to figure it out. Yes. So this is a very important image. So we have covered up till 10th of April 1919. Now we'll move beyond 10th of April 1919. This is the image, as you can make it out, of Jallianwala Bagh. If you haven't visited, you should visit. So if you talk about the Jallianwala Bagh tragedy or the Jallianwala Bagh massacre, definitely this is a very, very important, event in the pre-independent Indian history, and this has to be studied again in detail. So let us just proceed with it. So if you talk about Jallianwala Bagh massacre, a large crowd had gathered in the enclosed ground of Jallianwala Bagh. So yes, there was a huge crowd which had gathered in the enclosed ground of Jallianwala Bagh. By this point of time, people were not allowed to assemble because of the Rowlatt Act. Now, there are different interpretations regarding it. At some point of time, it is said that yes, people had gathered to attend the annual Baisakhi fair, and other interpretation says that they had just come to listen to some important leader. So whatsoever is the case, the fact is people had gathered and the Rowlatt Act was in place at the same point of time. So the government got this information, and then definitely the government became aware. Okay, people had gathered. Let us just even go with what is written in the slide, that people had gathered because they wanted to attend some annual Baisakhi fair, and they also had gathered because they wanted to repress. They wanted to actually agitate against the government repressive policies and measures. So this was the scene like before we actually talk about how the tragedy took place and what was the outcome of it. So we have General Dyer who entered this area, and he blocked the exit points and opened fire on the crowd, killing hundreds of people. First of all, people were not allowed to assemble. People assembled. People assembled because they wanted to agitate against the colonial government repressive policies, and they were also to attend the annual Baisakhi fair. And with the Rowlatt Act in place, the government instantly ordered General Dyer to arrive on the scene. And General Dyer absolutely blocked the exit points and allowed his men to open fire on the crowd, killing hundreds of people. This was inhuman. And then this actually renewed the protest in the country against the massacre. Hundreds of people were killed, as the official data says, but it could be more than that. So the government responded with brutal repression again. So once this tragedy happens, people again, renewed this protest against the repressive policy of the colonial government. So when people renewed, when they started their policies, when they started their protest against the colonial government again, That means the government will not sit back, and the colonial government again started the act of suppression and repression. So, what was this act of suppression and repression on part of the colonial government? So, the brutal repression seeking to humiliate and terrorize the people. The satyagrahis were forced to rub their noses on the ground, to crawl on the streets, to do salam. Salam means salute to the sahibs. They were humiliated, they were terrorized, flogging, villages were bombarded. So this is the way how the satyagrahis were treated. And this particular act is considered absolutely brutal because this is inhuman. When all this was happening, Gandhiji called off the movement because Gandhiji realized that yes, it was all turning violent. While the Rowlatt Satyagraha had been a widespread movement, it still was limited to many cities, mostly cities and towns. So we cannot say that it was an all India movement. We cannot say that the Rowlatt Satyagraha was an all India movement. It was just limited to the cities and the towns. And Gandhiji became aware that yes, the movement was turning violent. So he definitely called off the movement. So let us just review what is given in this slide. The Jallianwala Bagh massacre which took place, that was basically something which was not, this kind of gathering was not allowed by the government, by the colonial government. People had gathered to actually agitate against the repressive policy of the government and also to participate in the annual Baisakhi fair. So when this information reached the government ordered General Dyer to arrive on the scene. Mr. Dyer arrives on the scene, just blocks the exit points of the Bagh, Jallianwala Bagh, and allows his men to open fire on the crowd that killed hundreds of people. Then again, when this happened, when this mass killing happened, the Satyagrahis, they became much more aware about the brutal policies and they renewed their activities and of agitation. The government, in return of that, to check these activities, government dealt with the Satyagrahis in a brutal manner. They were forced to rub their noses on the ground, crawl on the streets, do salam to the sahibs. They were humiliated, terrorized, flogging, and the villages also were bombarded. When all this turned absolutely violent, Gandhiji called off the movement, and the Rowlatt Satyagraha, we can say, was still limited to the cities and towns. And with all this, Gandhiji realized that yes, there was a need to launch a more broad-based movement in India. So he started preparing for that, and then we have the next development coming up, or the next set of movement coming up. So he was absolutely certain that no such movement could be organized in the country without bringing the two important communities together, that is the Hindus and the Muslims together. Because he believed in the concept of unity, he believed in the concept of united struggle. So he realized that it was very, very important that if one all India movement has to be introduced against the colonial government, it has to be a kind of united effort on part of the Hindus and the Muslims alike. So a united struggle. And with this, we talk about the introduction of the Khilafat movement in India. I hope this slide is clear to you. I'm proceeding to the next slide now. So Khilafat movement. If you have not heard about it, you can just try to find out some more details about who is the Khalifa and what is the Khilafat movement and Turkey and Ottoman Turkey. So we are aware of the First World War, and the First World War led to absolutely the defeat of the Ottoman Turkey. Now the Ottoman Turkey, or the emperor if I talk about, of the Ottoman Empire, was considered as the spiritual head of the Islamic world. That means this Ottoman emperor was the spiritual head or the leader of the Islamic world throughout the globe. That means the Muslim community looked up to this leader. With the defeat of the Ottoman Empire, the Ottoman Empire was to be divided amongst the winning forces. So, two set of developments happening. First is First World War ended. After the war, the defeat of the Ottoman Turkey, the division of the Ottoman Empire amongst the winning forces or the parties of the First World War, and the spiritual leader. Who is he? He is the Ottoman Emperor, who is considered as the spiritual leader in the Islamic world. So all this had a kind of impact on India as well. That is the pre-independent India I'm talking about. So the Muslims throughout, the country, they decided to force Britain to change her Turkish policies, because Great Britain was one party to the First World War. So definitely, whatever was happening with Turkey, and whatever decision was imposed on Turkey, that means Great Britain also was involved in that. So the Muslims, they wanted Great Britain actually to change the Turkish policies. So with all this kind of development taking place, a Khilafat committee was introduced. And we have two important Muslim leaders here, namely Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali. So these two leaders, they collaborated with Gandhiji for a united action against the colonial government, taking this issue to the forefront. So Gandhiji was already looking for one good opportunity where the Hindus and the Muslims could have come together and could have led a common united struggle against the colonial government, and this was the best ever kind of opportunity, and this was just picked up by Gandhiji. So Gandhiji saw this as an opportunity to bring the Muslims under the umbrella of a united national movement. So at the Calcutta session of the Congress in 1920, he convinced other leaders of the need to start a non-cooperation movement in support of Khilafat as well as for Swaraj. So 1920 session of Calcutta session of Congress becomes very important, because he is putting up this resolution for the need to start the non-cooperation movement in support of the Khilafat issue as well as for attainment of Swaraj. So please know this slide very thoroughly, dear students. We have just talked about the Khilafat movement. We have talked about the kind of decision imposed on Ottoman Turkey. Turkey was to be divided amongst the winning powers, as well as the spiritual head or the Ottoman emperor was to step down as the Khalifa. Then the Muslims in India, they also wanted Great Britain to change the policies towards Turkey. You have Muhammad Ali and Shaukat Ali. They formed the Khilafat committee together with the aid and support of Mahatma Gandhi ji, and Gandhiji saw this particular movement as the right movement to actually call for a kind of united struggle on part of the Muslims and the Hindus against the colonial government. So in the Calcutta session of 1920, September 1920, he convinced the other leaders as well for the need to start the non-cooperation movement in support of two issues, Khilafat as well as for Swaraj. Swaraj, Swa, own, Raj, independence. Here, independence, Raj means here, our own rule. So Swaraj means self-rule here. So you have Khilafat issue as well as non-cooperation movement, and then the Swaraj movement. So all coming up together, and the leaders have got together to actually lead the non-cooperation movement, supporting the Khilafat issue as well as the Swaraj issue. I hope all the slides are clear to you by this point of time. And because we just talked about the Khilafat and the Swaraj issue through the non-cooperation movement, we will now start with the non-cooperation movement in detail, and we'll just discuss a bit about it before we are done for the day. So, non cooperation, if I just talk about the word non cooperation means not cooperating. Not cooperating with whom? Not cooperating with the colonial government. So, this was a movement again started by Mahatma Gandhi ji. Okay, because one movement already was a failure. He wanted a united movement, a united struggle. So, he introduced, and the Calcutta session, we have to remember this. So, in this famous book, Hind Swaraj, if you ever get time in life, please go through it. So, he wrote Hind Swaraj and he declared that the British rule was established in India with the cooperation of the Indians and had survived only because of the cooperation. So, he's making it very clear that yes, the colonial power could actually rule us because of the cooperation on part of the Indians. And the moment the Indians refuse to cooperate, that means the rule will end. The foreign rule will end. If Indians refuse to cooperate, the British rule would collapse within a year and Swaraj would be established. So, this is his belief, and he's very right because he's very firm about his belief. So, but he was actually into this idea as to how non cooperation can become a movement. First of all, it has to be, for if you talk about a movement, that means it has to be followed by a large number of people, and the ideology also has to be accepted by the people, okay, throughout. And the practices and the goals of the movement has to be very, very clear with the participants. So let us just talk about how non cooperation was to turn into a movement. Gandhiji proposed that the movement should unfold in stages. Okay, so he's talking about that yes, the non-cooperation movement should take place step by step, stage by stage. So what step, what stage? Let us talk about it. It should begin with the surrender of titles that the government awarded. So any titles the government awarded to the Indians, that should be surrendered. Boycott of civil service. Those who were into civil service, those who got through the civil service, they should boycott it. They should not join the service. Most should not write the civil service examination. Boycott of army, boycott of police, boycott of courts, boycott of legislative council, boycott of schools and foreign goods. Which schools I am talking about here? I am talking about the government schools. A government school at that point of time is different than a national school. A national school at that point of time was established and led by the Indian leaders. And if I'm talking about the government school at that point of time, that means I'm talking about the British government. I hope I am clear with this. So when all this will happen, when the titles will be given up, when the courts will be boycotted, when the government schools will be boycotted, when the civil service examination will be boycotted, when the army, police, foreign goods will be boycotted, when all this will happen, then definitely it will turn into a kind of movement. Okay, and this was all happening. Boycott happened. Giving up of titles happened. Boycott of schools, boycott of colleges, boycott of courts, boycott of police, boycott of army, civil service, all this happened. And when all this happened, what happened again? Very simple. Again, the government will react and suppress these activities. And the government did exactly the same. So if the government will suppress, then a full civil disobedience movement campaign will be launched. So Gandhiji was aware that yes, a full civil disobedience movement campaign will be launched the moment these activities will be repressed and suppressed by the government. This is also an image I have picked up from the book itself in CRT. You can see the charkha here, the huge charkha, and you can see the different participants here, and how the Muslim community also participated in this. So if you see this slide, the non-cooperation movement, you have the boycott of the army, police, courts, schools, legislative council. So through the summer of 1920, Gandhiji and Shaukat Ali, they toured extensively. They took a tour of the country, different parts of the country, and they mobilized the popular support for the movement. That means they started gaining popular support. That means the public support. The word popular means public here. And many within the Congress, they were concerned about the proposals as well, maybe because they did not agree with Gandhiji. Now, if you talk about a group, a group which was not ready to actually boycott the elections to the Legislative Council. So they were reluctant. The word they means those in the Congress who were not ready to actually boycott the elections to the Legislative Council, which was to be conducted in November 1920. They feared that the movement might lead to popular violence. So, in the same year, in the month of September and December, we see that there was a kind of intense tussle, within the Congress. Intense tussle means I talk about some kind of disagreement. It's not that every congressman, agreed to what was passed in the Calcutta resolution. So here you see a kind of disagreement amongst the members of the Congress not agreeing for what is called boycott to the elections of the Legislative Council. So there seemed to be no meeting point with the supporters and the opponents of the movement. So that means they did not agree on this. And finally, at the Congress session at Nagpur in December 1920, a compromise was worked out and Congress and the non-cooperation program was adopted. So with much disagreement, with much kind of tussle between the Congress members, finally in 1920, Nagpur session of the Congress becomes very important because you may also get a question on this, that yes, the non-cooperation program was adopted at this session. So you talk about the Nagpur session, December 1920. So this is how it was worked upon. And yes, the congressmen, they agreed that yes, non-cooperation movement was something which will be implemented, which will be practiced and which will be thoroughly practiced by the participants throughout the country. And the credit for this goes to Mahatma Gandhi ji as well, and the Khilafat leaders also who cooperated, because the idea was to not cooperate with the government in context of the Khilafat issue, and also not to cooperate with the government in context of what is called Swaraj, because the ultimate idea and the goal was to attain Swaraj or self-rule. Now, how this movement was to unfold in different parts of the country, which were the different set of participants in it, how did different social groups, conceive this idea of non-cooperation movement, this is something which we have to actually discuss it in detail bit by bit. And from here, we'll pick it up in the next class again. So I hope the class was clear to you. And please also, while you are reading, while you are, watching my video, try to just listen to it. Maybe if you are not understanding once or twice, and also go through your NCERT at the same point of time.